Good evening and welcome to another episode of the Perceptive Podcast. Here on Game Wisdom, we examine the art and science of games. We have another indie developer interview lined up for today's chat. My guest is from the studio Little Bat Games, and they are working on the visual novel Vampire Therapist. And they are on to not only talk about that, but we're also going to have a chat about sustainable game development, as we had a lovely bit of news dropped at the time of us recording this. So, please welcome to the podcast, Cyrus Nemati. How are you doing?
Thank you very much, Josh. I am doing grand. It's 11 o'clock here in Berlin, but I'm always ready to talk game design and the state of this ridiculous industry we're in.
Morning, noon, and night. It seems to be when I can chat about game dev, for sure. But it is a pleasure to have you on. Thanks again for reaching out. And for any developers watching this, again, if you would like to come on and chat about game dev, an upcoming project, or anything else, please reach out. I'm always looking for guests. So, since this is your first time on the cast, Cyrus, could you talk a little bit about who you are and what is kind of like your background when it comes to game dev?
Sure. I come from a weird background where I used to be in the public policy world in Washington, D.C., and I realized I was spinning my wheels, as I think a lot of people do in that kind of work. So it pushed me toward doing what I always wanted to do, which was get into voice acting. So I quit that work. I moved out west, and I started doing a lot of voiceover in games. I was doing a lot of point-and-click adventure games. I had an agency that was hooking me up with some, more larger scale things. I eventually hooked up with Supergiant, and I was working on Pyre and Hades. It was going well for a while, and then I had the opportunity to leave the States and go work at a game company in Germany as a writer. So that's what I did. And working at a big, successful studio is not always what it's cracked out to be. So I went off on my own, and luckily there are a lot of funding mechanisms for people looking to start their own studios in Germany. You don't need to ask for a lot of money, which is nice. So I started Little Bat Games in order to do the kind of games that I wanted to do, like games that start with comedy, have strong voice acting, and are a little weird and off kilter. That's my kind of thing. So yeah, that's my basic background.
Nice. And it's great to talk to another voice actor as well, because I've interviewed a few in the past. And it's always nice to kind of like talk about like that side of the industry. I don't know if we'll have time to chat too much about voice acting tonight, but if we don't, I would love to have you back on to have a chat on that topic for sure.
Sure, absolutely. I feel like the voice actors are doing it right, because when you finish a voiceover gig, you know you're not going to stay at the studio, so it's actually more predictable.
Yes. So, for the people listening to us right now, the point that we're kind of talking about in terms of sustainable game development has been the very, very recent announcement of Tango Gameworks and Arcane Austin being shut down along with several other studios by Microsoft. And this comes with just yet another round of more studio closures that's been happening over the last 5 months of 2024. So, it's been a very depressing time. And I guess I do want to talk more about Vampire Therapist, but I guess since we're on that topic,
sure.
What are your as you said, you worked at studios, you kind of seen things from the inside out. How are you feeling right now about this news that we've been having?
Well, I feel like this news has been inevitable. The game industry is bigger than it's ever been, and it's continuing to get bigger, and that means that the consolidation is getting out of hand, because every major studio needs to have a larger quarterly profit. And when we're talking about studios like Microsoft, the kind of quarterly profit that they need to have is just way out of hand. I mean, I feel like the FTC needs to do a little bit more work in splitting up these companies, because, this is what happens, is that buyouts happen, studios get shut down. Embracer was the big one here in Europe that came out, and they were buying up everyone. They were even, in some cases, using government funding to buy studios and not produce games. So to see this kind of consolidation and destruction happening, it's, again, totally unsustainable. Game studios don't need to grow, 11% every quarter. 1% is fine, or even 0%. Don't become a public company. How about that?
Yeah. And as kind of like another like a nail or a stab in the back, I just got my email from Humble telling me, hey, guess what? Hi-Fi Rush is on the latest Humble bundle or Humble choice. So that's great.
Yeah, this is another thing that studios often do is when, we're big conglomerates. What they do is they will buy up a studio, they will take the IP, they will take the product that exists, and then they will remove the cost of production, only sell what exists already. So all of a sudden, their balance sheets look amazing because they're not paying employees anymore, but they're still selling product. And that's like a perfect example of that.
Mm-hmm. And the reason why I was a little bit late in our chat today was I had to record a video on this topic because I needed to rant for myself on it. And it is a very, again, it's a very depressing time. And as you said a few minutes ago, like you work with, of course, Supergiant Games, and they just announced, or they just literally dropped on everyone Hades 2 at the time I was recording this. And like studios like Supergiant, Clay Entertainment, Kit Fox, and a lot of the other indie side, they've done a really fantastic job of keeping themselves sustainable. I've talked about Clay many times before. Like, Clay has had a very wide spectrum of games. Has every one of their games done, auction non-included levels of success? No. But they don't need that. They don't need every game to be bigger and more profitable than the last.
Yes.
And it is something that, it's that kind of thing that we see from a lot in these studios. And I'm sure for yourself with the studio that you've set up, like, you've obviously had to think about this in terms of how do I stay in this industry for more than 1 year?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, this is one of the things I wanted to do going into it was produce games that are ambitious at modest cost. And I don't want my costs to increase on my next project. I've spent a lot of time building up the tools, and I would like to have a very similar budget for the next game. And that way, if revenue is good, then it can't hurt me at all. I mean, just because I've been careful about how I'm spending my money. This was one of the reasons why I was really happy to start this business in Germany, because I feel like in America, if I'm to start an indie studio, the people that you typically have to go to are, well, either family, friends, that kind of thing, or you go to a venture capitalist, and they're going to be giving a much bigger investment and expecting a much larger return. I didn't want that. I want a modest investment and a modest to good return. I mean, I obviously hope my game does super well, but I can manage this budget. And a lot of budgets these days are pretty unmanageable.
Yeah, and about last year, I interviewed someone who was like part like of an angel investor firm for like video game studios, and they were talking about like the people who invest in games these days. They want those big numbers. They want to see, Genshin Impact numbers, Call of Duty, Destiny 2 numbers, but that is not really sustainable. And again, like for for you sitting there, for everyone watching this, we all know that for every one of those games we hear about, there's probably a few dozen, if not a few hundred studios that never get anywhere close to that level. And excuse me. And your comment again about keeping like to a modest budget. Again, this is stuff that I've interviewed developers like Jeff Vogue, Jake Perquette on. And yeah, it is, again, part of what keeps them alive. And it affords these studios the chance to do those very weird, those very experimental games. Again, like, as we're saying, you're chatting right now, Helldivers 2, Baldur's Gate 3, like, these games didn't just come out of, like, a, novice studio. Someone didn't just, like, throw money into a hole and those games popped out. It took years for those studios to reach the point where they could make those games.
Yeah.
And again, like, I just made this comment on the video that I recorded, that anyone who thinks that you can just throw money at a studio and say, go make Baldur's Gate 4, or go make a Hades, or go make a Helldivers 3, it's never going to work.
No, I've read the stories that Hasbro is saying, like, Larian's not going to do Baldur's Gate 3, but we're going to do it, and it's just going to be
Hmm.
as big and as awesome. And I'm like, nobody believes that for a second.
Hmm. And yeah, it is. And to your point about like studios going public, like again, like it seems like everyone these days is saying like that has been one of the worst things. And one thing that you were talking about before we start was kind of like the protections or something that you see in Europe. And I was wondering if you could
Mhm.
kind of elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you know from looking at the industry for the past several years, there were some unionization attempts that failed. They collapsed either because of corporate pressure or infighting. However, in Europe, we do have some mechanisms to ensure that developers have a seat at the table in their own companies. We have something called a works council, which isn't a union, but it is exactly what I said, a seat at the table where they know what is coming up, like they have a say in hirings, firings, that kind of thing. There are voices for the employees, and they have a much lower barrier to creation than unions do. So I would certainly like to see this growing more. I hear more talking about it in studios in Europe, and I would just love to see more of it. My studio is exactly the right size to support one. But it's a very small
Mhm.
number. I think it's something like 5 people have to be involved, and they can say like, "Okay, we want to start a works council," and they can do
Mhm.
that. Um, yeah, I've gotten fired up about this stuff over the past few years just
Yeah.
because it's hard to watch these efforts implode. If I go back to voice acting, at least they have a strong union that does protect their actors, and there is no reason why we cannot have this in game dev.
Yeah.
We're our own worst enemies a lot of the time.
Hmm. And I know it's Olivier Nelson who does was it Strange Scaffold.
Yeah.
Like he I think had a big interview or a big piece he did a few weeks ago about keeping his studio sustainable.
Hmm.
And yeah, it's always been like one of those issues. And I guess as a question for you, like again, like with your background going from kind of government to voice acting to game dev, it
Hmm.
was always felt like to me like part of the issues when it comes to game dev has been just the rapid rate that the industry has grown. Again, we
Yeah.
are now just shy of like 40 years since
Hmm.
Nintendo brought things back with the NES. And
Hmm.
in that time, we have seen again, like even just going from 2000 to 2020 has
Yeah.
been just a colossal rate of growth. And
Mhm.
I could rant and rave about game preservation as well, because I think it kind of fits in
Oh,
with
me
this
too.
topic. But we've never really, I think, had a chance to like stop and just set some really like general practices or I guess like
Mhm.
guidelines for how this industry should work. And it has, I think, really come back to bite things in a lot of ways.
Yeah, no, if you look at the film industry, for instance, it has a much longer history, and it has been through these points in American history as well. Things like the period of the Great Depression, where you had a reassessment of how the financial systems worked. We haven't had anything like this in, well, not since Reagan times. Was when our financial systems were, like, again, turning toward more laissez-faire sort of capitalism. So we don't have regulatory systems that are working as well as they should have. The FTC has tried so many actions in the past 3 years, but it is really hard to do the kinds of actions that would really make a difference, like splitting up the Microsoft. That could happen, and maybe should
Mm-hmm.
happen, or the way we're starting to get action here on the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store. These are long overdue actions that could really make a difference.
Mm-hmm. And we've been seeing again, like when it comes to the industry, especially with Microsoft as an example, like a year ago, maybe even less than that, there was all this buzz about Microsoft buying Activision Blizzard. This is going to fix Activision Blizzard. They'll become,
Yeah.
peak Blizzard again. And just as we saw a lot of people saying how much like Games Pass was going to save the industry, and again, like for myself and for I'm sure you as well, I have seen so many of these cycles play out again and again with people trying to chase the latest trend or saying like so and so is going to break the industry wide open. And a
Yeah,
lot of times it just never really happens. And what we've seen has been that the studios that have had like the biggest push has been the indie space. The likes
absolutely.
again of stuff like Disco Elysium, Dwarf
Mhm,
Fortress, which just got its actual like credible like product release last year. Like
mhm.
again, like what we see from these studios and what has been so great, like being able to cover indie games, has been just being able to see these original ideas take shape.
Yeah.
And it's why, like, for myself, I really don't care as much about the AAA market anymore, just because I have so many indie games to play, and I want to support games from smaller studios so that
Mhm.
they get that chance to go make their next game. Because again, you never know which game will be that Helldivers or that Disco Elysium, and the only way to really get a chance at that is for studios to survive more than one product.
Yep, yep, that would be really nice. That's certainly what I'm hoping for.
So, to take this to a vampire therapist, then. So,
Yeah.
what is kind of like the pitch for the game for the people listening to us?
Well, the nice thing about it is that the title tells you everything you really need to know. And the question that does come out is are your clients vampires or are you playing as a vampire? The answer is both. One really the game is therapy. You are learning actual cognitive behavioral therapy concepts and applying them to historical vampires, people who have lived hundreds, even thousands of years. Um, and I wanted to do a game where you are actually learning these cognitive behavioral concepts. As I've been developing the game, I have internalized a lot of these terms that I had faced myself in therapy plenty. But by turning it into a game, it's something that I feel is much more resonant. It can really stick with you. So yeah, that's really the pitch. Is it's comedy vampires. They're sexy because vampires have to be, but they've all got a lot of charm and history behind them. So I think it's a special game myself.
Mm-hmm. And with making a vampire therapist, so this is going to be more on the visual novel side. I guess, like, for people listening, like, what, I guess, like, how much can the player influence the story of it?
You know what's funny is that the presentation of the game is visual novel, but I don't consider it a visual novel myself, and I think most people who play it also don't consider it a visual novel. What you are doing during the course of the game is you have essentially an inventory of cognitive distortions. Cognitive distortions are ways that we think about the world that don't align with reality. For instance, one of the ones that I show off in my trailer is should statements. The idea that one should do something based on some external expectation. It's not based in reality. So you're getting terms like this, and they act as an inventory. And as you're talking to players, as you're talking to clients, you have the opportunity to use these distortions from your inventory. So I try to simulate natural conversation, and there are just these points where you can interrupt and challenge the people you're talking to. Um, I try not to have too long without interactions. So it is, I think, more interactive in a lot of ways than one expects from a visual novel. I've got some mini games in there too, and I've got a simulation of mindfulness meditation that I'm actually pretty stoked about. But yeah, I've tried to do something a little bit different. But visual novel is a medium that I think shows characters really strongly. They're big on screen, and frankly, it's something I'm capable of producing as a pretty amateur programmer myself.
Kind of sounds a little bit like the Phoenix Wright games in terms of being able to, like, interact and kind of, like, interrupt, like, the flow of the conversation like that.
Yeah, that was an early inspiration for me. It was certainly Phoenix Wright because, like, yeah, it's the same sort of thing where, yeah, there's a lot of talking, but you have an inventory. You have the ability to challenge people in the courtroom. Originally, when I conceived of this thing, it was much more like Phoenix Wright, and over time, it changed to be a bit like more therapeutic in nature. There is a game that I think is quite similar mechanically to mine, which is called Socrates Jones Pro Philosopher. And instead of being about therapy, it's about philosophy. Like, you talk to philosophers throughout history to get a sense of what their philosophy is, and you're using rhetorical devices that the game teaches you. So I really liked that game. It's free, it's short. They're working on a sequel. I highly recommend it.
Nice. And with kind of like the therapy and the psychological aspect of
Mhm.
vampire therapists, I guess in terms of doing stuff like that, this is a conversation I think I've had in the
Yeah.
past regarding kind of the challenges of dealing with like serious or emotional topics. Like,
Mhm.
how do you balance kind of having like these serious conversations about, helping someone and mental health
Yeah.
versus again like the gaminess or, the gamification of these mechanics?
Yeah, for me, the solution was comedy and history. The nice thing about history is, and the main theme of the game really, is that we always could have used therapy. Honestly, we could have used it even more, 1,000 years ago. Um, but the problems that we face as humans are the same ones that we've been having, for 50,000 years. Our biological systems tell us through our neuropsychology. Those are what generate our fear response. When our cortisol level goes high, we are afraid of something. And human fear is animal fear. When we have a
Mhm.
bad conversation with a boss or something like that, um, it's the same to us as though a lion is chasing us. So we have human issues, but we have animal responses. So by using history as a way of talking about these things, it means that everything that has happened that is traumatic happened a long time ago. I have characters that are 3,000 years old. I've got a bronze, like for instance, I've got a Bronze Age character who was sold to a rival chieftain for a gold necklace. This is based on a lot of the things that were going in Bronze Age Ireland. This is an Irish character. And she makes a joke saying that, like, oh, well, the necklace that my dad got, it would have been worth two girls. So she's just joking about it because so much time has passed that, the trauma is lessened, even though the issue is very serious. And it lets me deal with things in a lighthearted way, but still really talk to these, often painful circumstances.
And it's always, I think, tricky for games like this in terms of when we talk about like kind of like serious or real life issues, in
Hmm.
terms of like kind of like that balance between having to talk about it versus kind of like the glorification of it. It's a topic
Yeah.
that we see a lot when it comes to games that let you play as like the evil character or someone
Hmm.
does a bad thing in a game.
Yeah.
And for you and Vampire Therapist, I guess, how do you walk that line between we have to talk about very serious
Hmm.
and very potentially triggering issues, but we
Yeah.
don't want to seem like we're making light of it, or it's like +5 to optimism you get for
Yeah.
revealing your pain.
Yeah, I've taken a very like human approach to this, which is that anyone who has, well, right, if you're living on this planet, and living on this planet is not easy, and everybody has their own particular challenges. When you are like, the point of the game is that you are learning to become a therapist as this 19th century cowboy. You're coming to Europe to learn how to do this, but you are learning lessons immediately. And the first one is to approach clients with compassion, no matter where they're coming from, and no matter how like lighthearted things can be, or no matter how dark things can be. We start with compassion, and that makes it a lot easier to, start with empathy and know that we are being considerate of another person. And I stick to that pretty religiously in the game. I've got a narcissist character that is really hard to deal with because I really wanted to write a narcissist character, and I'm sure that there's going to be plenty of points where players will be like, "Oh, screw this asshole," but I wanted to again bring it back to compassion because I feel like that really grounds the game and makes it, even though these are all vampires, it makes it much more human.
Mhm. And I guess with like the route of the game, as you said that the player can interact at different moments. Are
Yeah.
there multiple endings or multiple routes, or is there kind of like a fixed ending to like each conversation?
There is a fixed ending. I didn't want to get into a territory of you're not being able to help clients. However, there is a lot of replayability built in because as you are learning these terms, you're entering a session with these different inventory items. Like before going into a session, you say, "Oh, this client is more likely to disqualify the positive, or this character overgeneralizes." And they're always present. All of the distortions are always present in every conversation because that's just part of being human. But depending on what you go in with, you're going to get different sorts of challenges.
And with, I guess, like developing a vampire therapist, one question I always like to ask developers: so, what engine are you using for the game?
So I'm in Unity,
Okay.
and I'm using like various middlewares. I'm using a software called Nanny Novel for the visual novel aspects. But I've done quite a lot of hacking to make it something that was writable. It's a pretty long game, and making it something where the game engine would get out of my way was kind of a first priority.
hmm And again, like especially for designing a visual novel, like one of the things I always hear when I talk with developers who do visual novels is that there's a lot more work to it than I think a lot of people think in terms of making a
Mhm.
really solid one. For a vampire therapist, anything in terms of the design of it, like as a visual from the visual novel format, that you
Yeah.
found particularly like interesting or challenging for you.
Well, I think with any game, including visual novels, UI is king. Do the players understand what they're getting into, especially if you are teaching something? So for Vampire Therapist, I needed to make it very clear what sorts of distortions were available to the player. Once they got them, making sure that they had a reference guide, like a way to uh, see examples and see what would actually work for them, and making sure that it's clear when distortions can be used, when they can't be used. So a lot of this really comes down to UI, and I have a absolutely fantastic UI artist who not only was able to make all of these actions really clear to players, but did it in this awesome, very batty theme. My studio is Little Bat Games, so I love to have bats everywhere.
Yep. And I'm right now writing my book on RTS design, and I
Yeah.
spent a whole lot of time talking about good GUI and UI UX work in that
Yep.
genre.
Yeah, no, I mean that is another big one. I think the reason that Blizzard in its heyday was so successful is not only because they had very easy to read character design, but I don't think the industry has ever seen better UI design than what Blizzard was doing for years. Not only with their
hmm
RTS games, but Hearthstone was also just incredible. I still look at Hearthstone as a reference even though I'm not a deck builder person. But the UI is just so good, and it makes it like if you make characterful UI that still communicates to the player what they need to do, that is so much of the work done for you.
For sure. And as like a funny point, I'm right now the recording of it, looking at the history of Command and Conquer, and just enjoying
Yeah.
like the whole like vertical command bar.
Uh
And
huh.
it is very important, especially for any kind of game, to convey this information as simple and as straightforward as possible. Because this is oftentimes where I see a lot of indie developers struggle with when it
Mm-hmm.
comes to good UI UX and good GUI practices. Because as you were saying earlier, with being able to stay sustainable, you
Mm-hmm.
need people to be able to play your game. You need to be able to grow that
Yeah.
market. And if someone loads up your game and goes, "What the heck is this?"
Mm-hmm.
uninstall and refund within 40 seconds, you're never getting that person back. And it is very hard. I guess, like, to bring this as a question to you, like, in terms of thinking of the GUI and the UI for vampire
Yeah.
therapists, how did you settle on this? Like, what did you want, what you didn't want? Like, how did you build this, like, in your mind before you put it to code?
Actually, I did some pretty rapid prototyping. Once the idea for the game came about, I did some very basic Unity UI button placement, getting things in an arrangement that felt good, like it made sense. I mean, given that in visual novels, one of the biggest elements of the screen is the text printer. So that text printer is something that I expanded to be able to hold all of the UI elements, and that was something that I did very early on, like even before it was designed in an aesthetically pleasing way, I still had the basic system and functionality where I had a row of buttons along the bottom, alongside the printer, and any other sort of actions that would come up would be dynamic because I didn't want to have too much in the player's way. In a visual novel, again, people are reading a lot, so don't distract from where the eyes are going to be. But yeah, I think the rapid prototyping was a big help to see that, okay, this game is actually going to work, because it was, I wasn't always sure of the route that I was going to take. I think originally I had a much more standard visual novel experience planned, where it was really about the choices and the branching and that sort of thing. And I don't have so much of that right now. It really is about the therapy aspect, and that being able to test it early was huge.
And with kind of building like the format for a vampire therapist, another question I like to ask developers is, when you first came with the idea for the game, has like that initial concept changed at all as you went into development, or has it kept relatively like standards, kind of strict or straight from that original thought?
I think I stuck with the original concept pretty well. There were things that changed significantly, like, the story, main character, that kind of thing. They changed a lot from the beginning, just because I found that, again, that compassion aspect is a double-edged sword. One, it can be really great in terms of the therapy aspect, but it runs the risk of making a game boring. Which is where my cowboy came from. It was originally going to be this very wise old 3,000-year-old therapist who had been through everything, and I was writing the dialogue, and I'm like, this guy is sucking all the fun out of the room. So now he's your teacher, and that makes it much better.
Yep, and especially with like writing, like the dialogue and the conversations for these games, that's another thing that it can really do or die a game. If people aren't they aren't interested in your story, if your main character is putting them to sleep, or if it takes too long to kind of like introduce like that hook, or I'm going to say, pun intended, the bite of your game in this case, it can drive people away, especially if your game is very story driven. Because a lot of people who will play a story driven game, they want to, they want to know what is the hook of this game, the second they load things up. Yes. And it can be very hard, to convey that to someone.
Yeah, I've been hyper aware of that, because I'm actually not a visual novel player myself. I'll play, the Phoenix Wrights occasionally and a few other things, but it's not a genre that I usually jump to, because, again, like, there is a lot of clicking, and that doesn't work for me. So I find that one of the best things for me in developing this game was really to use my voiceover skills, because it helps a lot in writing. I approach writing exactly the same way I approach voice acting, which is, I want to show as much character as I can in a small amount of space as possible. So that makes the writing easy if I can basically be voicing it on paper as I'm doing it. It's been a huge part of the game. I'm very happy with, I've got a fantastic cast, and I don't think the game could really stand on its own without them. Excuse me.
Ooh, yeah, no problem. My allergies are on and off being horrible, especially now they're entering the summertime.
Yeah. Luckily I'm inside working on this game all the time, so the pollen cannot reach me for the most part.
Yeah. And I guess with the voice acting for Vampire Therapist, I saw on the store page, so you're doing voices for it, obviously. Do you have any other notable voice actors or actresses doing it?
Yeah, I don't think I'm ready to announce them yet, but some of them will be recognizable, and I think one of them will be extremely recognizable. So yeah, no, this is a small but very mighty cast.
Nice.
Yeah.
And yeah, like being able to like put like, as you said, like kind of like doing like the voice of the game, doing the story in your head before you put it down.
Yeah.
Is like part of the challenge, I think, when it comes to game dev above, other genres or mediums, is that interactivity. And again, like I have harped many, many times here about kind of tutorials, onboarding new players' experience. With a Vampire Therapist, this may be kind of like a hard question to answer, but with it being like a visual novel being more like a dialogue driven, but are you, when you were coming up with this idea, were you conceiving it to be like for someone who's played like every visual novel style game, someone being like someone like brand new, or just someone who's just like curious about, wait, why is this game called Vampire Therapist?
I think that's the demographic that I'm targeting the most. If people hear vampire therapist and they say I'm into it, I want to reach those people. So yeah, I've tried to be very respectful of people's time and patience. I've done a lot of questioning of the game and a lot of rewriting and a lot of shortening and removing those periods of indulgence where I want to tell the jokes that I want to tell, in the interest of making sure that people are always engaged. And I try not to have too many lines without an interaction. And of course, the whole thing is voiced, and I think that's a really important aspect of it. Just to know that people don't have to be reading all the time; they can just listen, and the voice actually conveys a lot of information. Because again, it's therapy. The emotionality is really key to the game.
Yep. And it's definitely, as you said, like where like voice acting can really add to a title. Like we were saying earlier with stuff like Supergiant, like their
Yeah,
games are phenomenally well written, and of course very amazingly voiced as well. And it does drive character to these games. And if you can do it, and if you can do it well, it will always add additional. I guess again, will add more value to what this game can bring. It allows people again to
yeah,
become more memorable in your titles, and it helps these games stick out more, I think, in the player's mind.
yeah, and it's a much faster characterization than you'll get from just about anything. I mean, of course, visually, you look at a
Hmm.
character, you see what they're wearing, you see the expression on their face, you see their pose. All of these things can tell you endless amounts of information. Voice is exactly the same way. You can use so many shortcuts in characterization that are present in accent, tonality, the level of poshness at which one speaks. I mean, it tells you a lot about the character in a very, very short time, which is often pretty tough to do in writing alone.
Hmm. And speaking about like the writing for Vampire Therapist, and as you were just saying, in terms of like the amount of dialogue there is in this game, the
Yeah.
length of it, another challenge that we see from any kind of story-driven game, or just any game in general, is the pacing and the length of it. You can
Yeah.
have, you can make like a 400-hour long story if you want. That doesn't necessarily mean someone's going to be invested for 400 hours of that game. With
Yeah.
Vampire Therapist, like, what were you aiming for in terms of like the overall length? Like, is this going to be a game that's going to be like a chapter-driven game, or is it
Mhm.
just going to be about kind of, I guess, like each character just being like a conversation, and then you move on to the next, and you run out characters, story over.
So I wanted to, yeah. Sorry, get my thoughts.
Yeah, no
Get my
problem.
thoughts. There wasn't really a word count goal at any
Mhm.
point. It was more, what do the characters need? So I found the best structure to go about this was, I have 4 clients in the game. I'm going to have some more after release, but the game will launch with 4 clients, and each of those 4 clients has 5 sessions. And there is like a general arc that goes through them, and you're seeing each client's session one, each client's session two. So you're not going through with one character, you're constantly having breaks, and then you're returning to the characters that you've already been with, getting to see their growth, getting to push them. So I've found so far that that's a really nice way of keeping players engaged, because they'll start with a new client and they'll think, oh, I wanted to see what happened with the other one. Well, the other one's coming, and then you're getting to know a new person. The George R. R. Martin style of character POV switching, and in this case, I think it served the game well.
Mhm. Reminds me a little bit of when I played, was it the Infectious Madness of Dr. Decker, which was
Yeah, yeah,
therapy,
yeah.
but Lovecraft in that one.
Yes. Yeah, no, I think therapy lends itself well to this kind of structure, where you are definitely seeing progress. And really, that is a core tenet of any game design, is that the player needs to see progress, not only in story,
Hmm.
but in character and
Yeah,
when in gameplay, of course.
yeah. And as you were saying, I think it does kind of help keep the pace going when you kind of go from different characters, rather than just say, you're going to be with this one character for the next 40 hours. And then when you're done with them, here's another character for another 40 hours. It helps kind of, again, like break things up. And that is very important for any game, regardless of the genre. Just being able to keep the player, again, wondering what's going to happen next. Because if they know what's going to happen next for the next 60, 80 hours, they're going to be like, okay, I did this one battle, I get to do 700 more battles. Yay. Exactly. And they just fall asleep.
Yeah, that was why I wanted to make sure too. I mean, like, gameplay wise, it has to become more complex as the game continues. So that's where these cognitive distortions came in handy for me, because at the beginning of the game, the first session with your patients, you have 5 that you can choose from. It goes up to 8 to 11 to 13. So by the end of the game, you have a pretty big arsenal of these conceptual terms that you can use.
In terms of the characterizations for your various clients, how did you mentioned earlier about how they're going to be set between like different various ages of time, different people. How did you settle on, you said there's 4 in the main game, right?
Yes.
Okay. How did you settle on like which 4 did you want to be kind of like the main cast for Vampire Therapists?
So my process, my craft, is typically backwards. What I like to do is I like to start with a good joke. Like, what's a really comedic situation, and how do I get to that? So that, in a lot of ways, determined the sorts of characters that I put in the game. I wanted to have a character that had an internet addiction problem, and I thought it would be funny if they were really old. So this character is 1800 years old, and they're essentially an internet shut-in, and I wanted to get to this point. So what made sense for that? Like, where could I go to history? Where could I see an archaeological record that is still shrouded in mystery, so I can come up with my own details? So that's where I went for 3rd century Ireland for this particular character. I wanted a self-hating vampire, so I found out about this doctor in the 1600s, William Harvey, who was at the Royal College of Physicians, I believe under Henry VIII, and he mapped the circulatory system. He was able to see how blood went through the system, and as one of his experiments, he showed how he could make a dead pigeon heart beat by stimulating it. And I thought, oh, a vampire would love this. A vampire could get inspired and say, like, oh, there is life after death. So it was really like looking at these concepts and finding what elements of history would work for them. So I think it just revealed one today, that I've got a 18th century child theater star. And I'm like, oh, well, this is perfect. I'm just going to steal this guy's history. And doing that was really helpful. It was really just finding these concepts and seeing what historical figures would fit them. And in some cases, I wrote my own, and they are ancillary to characters in history, which gives me a lot of freedom.
And with the setting itself, like from the story pages, so it's set above a Gothic nightclub.
That's right.
In Germany, I believe. I guess, how did you settle on like where you want this game to take place? Because you said like you could have put this anywhere, you changed who like the main protagonist was. So what inspired you to use that as your setting for a vampire therapy?
Yeah, well, I live in Berlin, and we have this kind of nightlife where people are really all about it. I actually set the game in Leipzig because Leipzig is the goth capital of Europe. And the reason why I wanted to do this initially is because, like, again, I'm starting the game from a point of compassion. These vampires are trying not to be monsters. So when they are drinking blood from people, it's consensual. So if you're a vampire and you want consensual blood, where's the best place to go? A goth club. So it made sense for me. And also, like, given like the architecture and history here, I could have that old Gothic and that new like club kind of atmosphere. It's a weird mix, but I think it works pretty well.
And are there any other, besides the clients, are there any other like side characters or ancillary characters you're proud of for a vampire therapist?
Yeah, the therapy part of the game is entertaining and engaging, if I do say so myself. However, it is mentally taxing, I will say. Like you are learning these concepts and applying them. So I needed spaces for breaks. So in between sessions, you will spend time in the goth club and you will be meeting goths who want their necks bitten consensually. I have a goth priest who is kind of like, the shepherd in the darkness. I have a bartender who is in a relationship with the club owner, and they're trying to decide what to do with themselves living in a vampire world as a mortal. I've got some like Nosferatu type bouncer in the game. Yeah, I have a lot of these fun characters you can play with, and of course, the sexy goth types who are all into the kinky shit, just for that Berlin flavor that I live among here.
And to go back to kind of like the pacing and length of the game, like how long like are you aiming for as like the overall experience? Like again, not counting like any like post-release clients.
Yeah, I think the released game is going to be something between 10 and 12 hours of gameplay. I'm not sure whether that is if you blow straight through. However, the game does reward multiple playthroughs because again, you can enter sessions with different cognitive distortions and get different responses. And I think I have some achievements for that as well. So yeah, no, potentially it has a surprisingly long play time depending on how you play it. I didn't intend on that. I wanted a pretty brisk experience, and I guess it can be. But again, like the first time, probably going to be pretty slow, just because you really have to be paying attention to what characters are saying.
Mm-hmm. And one thing that I wanted to ask you before I forget, in terms like again, keeping with kind of like the mental health aspects of
Yeah.
it, is the player like allowed to fail? Like, are there any fail states in this game, or like no matter like what you do, like is it still possible to like I guess like solve the client's issue or end the session on a positive note?
There are no fail states. If you, I mean, you can get things wrong, certainly,
Mm-hmm.
but you will be nudged toward the correct answer by your mentor character. Again, it didn't feel good to have therapy be a fail. And this was something that I discussed with my consulting therapist as well.
Mm-hmm.
How do we want to depict things? And, we wanted to have a happy ending in the end. So, and also teach. So, by building into the game that anytime you get something wrong, you're always going to be pushed to the correct answer, I think it makes it much more of a relaxed experience. There are like achievement rewards, or you'll get some encouragement from your mentor if you are paying attention and getting a number of correct answers in a row, but you're never really getting punished.
And again, like when we're dealing with issues like mental health and trying to help people like this, you don't really like, again, this gets back to where I was saying earlier about like how there's always that line you have to walk between how gamey you want to make a serious topic,
Yeah.
and like keeping like some like the wackier options to like
Yeah.
achievements and completion is, I think that's a good middle ground for games like this, because you
Yeah.
want someone to go through the story and kind of experience it like legitimate, rather
Mhm.
than having them constantly thinking about, okay, how do I min max this to
Mhm.
100% my mental health bar, and if I
Right.
get 4 mental health bars in a row, I get the achievement for that.
Yeah, I've tried to build in some discouragement for that kind of gameplay. Like theoretically, you can go through the entire game with only the first distortions that you learn, but through the achievements, through some of the feedback the game gives you, you're encouraged to branch out and take some risks. It makes you better as a vampire therapist by the end.
I don't think there's any other questions I have for you regarding Vampire Therapist. Like, is anything that stands out or is unique for the game that we didn't touch on that you'd like to bring up?
Yeah, I think one of the aspects of the game that really makes it as strong as it is that we really did rely on outside consulting, not only in terms of therapy, but for history as well.
Hmm.
One of the characters of the game is Isabella d'Este. She is known as the First Lady of the Renaissance. She funded Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Andrea Mantegna. I have a whole thing where, like, she's looking at the Disney Plus world and believes that art is dead. And so, in doing research for this character, um, she wrote a lot of letters in her lifetime. She was around in the late 15th century, and she wrote a lot of letters, and someone translated them. An academic over in California translated 20,000 of these letters. I read them all to really get her character voice. And then I talked to the translator, the historian, who knew all this information about this character. And we really got into what her life's challenges were, and what things would have been like for a powerful woman in the late 15th century. So there is an authenticity that comes from using these first-handed sources that I think makes this game something pretty special. And I really tried to stick to that. The historical characters, what you will see matches up with their real history. And yeah, I think it makes these characters really compelling because it is definitely real. I even got this interesting tidbit that Isabella d'Este, when she died, she was supposed to be buried at this particular monument in Mantua, but her body went missing. It's just gone. Nobody knows where it is. So it's almost like, this is real. This is actually happening. She is a vampire. She never got put away. So getting these kinds of historical details was a huge benefit to the game.
And on the subject of getting like outside consulting for vampire therapists, I guess for developers listening to us, like, what was like kind of like the process? Like, do you like reach out to like therapists? Like, how do you like go about like looking for like consulting when it comes to games like this?
Well, I found it was actually quite easy because this is something unusual for people who are more in an academic perspective. And when I gave them the pitch, they were really excited from the start. I tried to pay and they wouldn't let me. They will get credit, obviously. But really, I find that if you are doing something weird and you know how to do a polite approach, I think that takes care of a lot of it. I definitely couldn't afford this help, so I'm glad I got it for free.
Nice.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's always good, like, in terms of like reaching out to people and getting them excited about these, because then they'll be able to like tell their friends and their colleagues about, hey, I worked on this weird little game, or I got to help them on this.
No, it's super unusual. I mean, usually an academic environment is pretty limited to academia, but something like this comes around, and yeah, it's something to talk about. And maybe the other academics will scoff, but they'll probably be a little jealous too.
Mm-hmm. Like, I reach out to libraries to do talks about like game design, game dev, and like sometimes I get librarians like, so I have the same about video games. Are you interested? And they go, yes, send it over. I need something like this.
Yeah, of course. I mean, like, yeah, it is something different, and the nice thing about games is they really do allow us to have interactive experiences, because that's what games are. But they can be interactive experiences about anything. Not every game needs to be. When my parents came to visit, I think last year, and I showed them where the state of the game was, and my dad's like, where's the jump button? And I'm like, we're not there anymore. Games can be for other things, and also I'm 43. I'm not playing the same games that I was playing when I was 6. Actually, I still am, but I play other games too.
Mm-hmm. All right. I think I'm just about. I guess one of the questions I had for you: how long have you been working on Vampire Therapist for?
It has been about 1.5 years. Yeah, like the original idea was about 2 years ago, but the game has probably only been in production for 1.5 years, and then a lot of that was my learning to program badly, but good enough.
And as for a release date, for people watching this right now, so you have an estimated date of mid-June, is that right?
I do indeed. June 18th is the day, unless something goes horribly wrong. But yeah, June 18th will be the day. It's going to come out right after Steam Next Fest. The demo will be available and Steam Next Fest on June 10th.
Nice. And thank you for telling me about the next Fest, because that means that's going to be where I'm going to be covering it for that week as well.
Yeah, I am excited. I'll just barely be ready in time.
I guess with Vampire Therapist, and again, like bringing this back to our original topic about kind of being sustainable in the industry.
Yeah.
have you given any thought to like what's next for your studio? Like, what is going to be your plans for Little Bat after Vampire Therapist is out?
So I do have a number of games planned in the pipeline. The first one is certainly a sequel, which will be set in America, dealing with American problems. But as I said, I want to work with a very similar budget to what I've got right now. It will actually go farther since I have the tech sorted out at this point, and we have our general characters, we have our style, we have less of this exploration to do. So we can do more with the same budget. Honestly, I really don't want my budget to increase very much. I would like to have, money that is real in the bank to be able to use to pay salaries. Right now, my team is all contractors because I would feel terrible about hiring them and knowing that I don't have the runway. I know so many people recently who have been hired by studios and 2 months later they get laid off. And I'm like, how the F do you have the soullessness to hire someone knowing that the money you're going to pay them with doesn't exist? So I would like to pay with real money rather than the promise of money, because I don't have that money. So this is why I want to keep things sustainable, so that when I do hire, and I would really love to bring some of my contractors on, pay the benefits, all that stuff. I want to know that I can pay them for at least the next year. So that's where the sustainability comes in, and making sure that my budgets are not ballooning to an unsustainable level.
Yeah. And to your point about being able to do more with the same budget, to get back to the point earlier about going these studio closures, part of what allows these studios to flourish is, again, being able to iterate from game 1 to game 2 to game X. Because, again, from your own point of view with Vampire Therapist, as you said, you've been working on this for a little over a year now, that you had to spend time figuring out how to program, how to do the engine. We had the whole conversation about UI, UX, and the GUI. Not having to worry about those things for game number 2, game number 3, and so on, frees you up to do other stuff. I still remember, the jump we saw from Assassin's Creed 1 to Assassin's Creed 2. And it's something that we harp on a lot about Nintendo. That a lot of people, I think, discredit Nintendo, saying they don't innovate, they don't do a lot of new stuff. But you see just how much they iterate from game to game. And you can't do that if you're just throwing everything out and saying, well, let's start back at 0 for our next game. And then we'll start back at 0 again. Again, at some point, the money does run out if you keep doing it like that.
No, that's a really good point. And I think that, talking about Assassin's Creed, I feel that, from what I hear of friends that have worked at Ubisoft, is that it is a safe job. It has its problems, as all studios do, and Ubisoft problems are not insignificant. However, job security is not something people there worry about. They can move to different projects. There is a lot of flexibility because, again, their tech stack is something that builds over time. I mean, we know this because we see them put out the same game with different titles and, iterative changes. But honestly, that's kind of a smart way to go about it. They're using assets that they have, which is something that I want to do as well. Yep.
And again, we hear all the great stories, or again, Nintendo is another shit. They do have their problems like everyone else, but again, they famously did not let anyone go when they had their rough patches following the Wii U.
Yeah, Capcom the same way. I really like reading their CEO's interviews because he's like, okay, well, I'll let the rest of the industry implode, but I'm going to run a company that makes products. Rather than makes money. I mean, the product is good, it will make money. It should be that simple.
I was thinking about Capcom today as well. As someone who has been following Capcom since the 90s, it has just been weird to see how much they've changed, or the last 7 years. The early 2010s was everyone thought Capcom was dying. They stopped making the good Resident Evil games. Everyone was yeah, who's really going to pay attention to Capcom anymore? And then we jump forward to Resident Evil 7 and Monster Hunter World, and like they are kind of like they're just like kind of like sitting in like a relaxing pool like, while the apocalypse is happening around them
Yeah.
as a AAA studio.
Yeah, there's no layoffs happening at Capcom. You know, their fortunes may not always be as good, but you're not seeing these crazy layoffs happening, and they're continuing to, put out products, and they do take risks.
Mm-hmm.
If you've ever played Resident Evil 6, you know that.
Oh yes. Mm-hmm. And you need to be able to give studios this flexibility to take those risks. Because
Yeah.
that's how they learn and how they grow. And more importantly, it sets up for long-term value. I was thinking
Mhm.
about Suda51 with Grasshopper as well today. Like, his games, they're not meant to be billion-dollar sellers. They're not meant to be the game that everyone stops what they're doing and playing. But they make up for that with just the idea of it, like the
Mhm.
conversation starter of playing something like No More Heroes, or was it Shadows of the Damned? And then
Yeah.
this leads to more people checking them out over time. So that when people finally hear about, hey, they made this really great game, they also have all these other great games that they can go back and play. And
Uh, yeah, going back to the preservation thing, like,
yeah,
it when a studio has a history like that and they're able to keep it up, I mean, I think that's what I mean. It creates more brand loyalty too. Something that you see like a studio like Blizzard is destroying.
oh yes. And Unity, don't forget them last year.
I know. I'm a Unity game, and it was definitely the best engine for me to go in on. But yeah, I mean, what a thing! I still play the games that I played 30 some years ago, and the idea that I would not be able to do that with a modern game is very yucky. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
was working in mobile, and mobile is the absolute worst for this. I mean, people who
Mm.
grew up playing mobile games that are never going to exist, and well, it would be great if the mobile games that exist now didn't exist in the future, but they had a few good ones back in the day.
Yep. Again, like I could spend the next like 3 hours talking about game preservation easily,
Yeah.
and it is very depressing. I again like for my RTS book, I'm playing Red Alert. I just finished playing Red Alert 3, which was I think 2008, 2009.
Yeah, that's an awesome one.
Yeah, and there are some games where you just literally can't play them anymore. And it
I
is
know.
so damn depressing, again, as someone who covers this industry and wants to be able to share all this stuff with people.
I wrote a piece in Slate some years ago about this regarding mobile in particular because years ago, I guess it was 2000 and oh, what year is it now? I don't even know anymore. I think it was 2018 or 2019. They released BioShock out on the iPad, and that game was playable on the iPad for 5.5 months. That's it. Gone. Like they did a system update, there was some incompatibility, and you could never play that game unless you had that particular iPad and never updated it. I mean, this shit is crazy.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And it's only going to get worse until it gets better, unfortunately. And again, like I've been harping on this for a while, that I do feel like we need to have some kind of game dev union set up for people.
Mhm.
And again, the stories are only going to get worse until something breaks.
Yeah, yeah. No, I would really like to see the next effort succeed. And I know that when these efforts come up, there is an awful lot of gaslighting that goes on along the part of management. I've
Hmm.
seen so many, uh, I don't know, so many people feel insecure about starting a unionization because they talk about all these risks. But this needs to happen, and it
Yeah.
needs to not implode. And I think what people need to go into this mindset of yes, it is risky to start a union in this environment, but it is more risky to not start one.
Yep.
You're getting laid off anyway, and you are not going like the little pat on the head your boss is going to give you is not going to sustain you in the next layoff period. So, and we also need to understand what unions do. They
Hmm.
exist to protect us. They have no other purpose. We're not going to change the way games are made, but we can protect our positions. and be more aware of them. And as long as we keep that in mind and don't get too excited about what these things can do, they have a simple goal, and that's what we need to stick to.
Yeah. And again, like with the news that's happening right now, like this is happening to studios that succeeded, that had a Game of the Year winning title.
Right.
And they're being shut down. It
Yeah.
is just mind-boggling in terms of, what is the successful number that they're looking for a game like Hi-Fi Rush or for Roller Drome last a few weeks ago.
Yeah, well, you know what they're really looking for is they're looking for something, month to month sustainable. Yep. They want subscriptions. Like the biggest game on earth right now is Monopoly Go. That game is barely a game. It is like, systematically designed to drain people's wallets regularly. And that's what this industry wants, is like that regular income coming in. I mean, to me, it's mind-boggling that Destiny had its crash thanks to its, the firing community managers and stuff like that, because they actually did have that monthly revenue. I mean, I guess Fortnite is still doing it, and they're getting bigger all the time in their own ways. But I mean, that's been the killer of so many studios. These live service games, which are meant to generate regular income.
Yeah, and again, like as we all know here, the video game industry is not about regular income. You're not going to be earning $10 million every month as a studio. That's just not how this industry works.
Yeah, I mean, because it's worked like, a handful of times, they're going to be chasing that like all the time. Like, cocaine-fueled product management meetings where they're going to they're going to get that same glory and it's going to be even bigger. But no, these things are very rare.
Yep. So I think with that depressing note, we could probably begin.
No, it's not. We still have Steam. We still have Steam. That's coming out, and they've got this Steam Deck where I'm playing games from 40 years on it, and weird games are coming out all the time, and we have this blossoming indie scene. So no, there's reason for optimism. It's just not going to be in the big spaces.
Yeah. So for everyone watching, buy all the indie games. Just buy them all.
Vampire Therapist first, because you're going to need it to weather the upcoming storm.
That could be a character in the sequel about the depression of a game developer vampire.
Oh man, I've tried to resist the self-indulgence, so we'll see.
All right, so for you, Cyrus, before I let you go for today, anything else? I guess first of all, in terms of social media, anything you would like to promote, sites, X, Twitter, Blue, whatever, go right ahead.
Just look up Little Bat Games. You will find everything. I'm very bad at social media. I've got a nice TikTok, though. TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, where I'm doing a regular series of cognitive distortions throughout history, where I look at various historical characters. But yeah, check out the game, vampiretherapist.com. Check it out on Steam. You'll know whether you like it or not immediately. You're going to love it or you're going to hate it. Nothing in between.
And anything in terms of where people can find you on, Facebook, X, Blue, whatever, go right ahead.
Yeah, I'm on the X. Thank you for calling it X. It's not Twitter anymore, and we shouldn't pretend that it is. So I am on the X.com. Ahoy Me Hearties is my handle. I'm the same on the Blue Sky. But really, I'm hoping they all die really soon. But you can still check it out there.
All right. And I guess any final thoughts, anything you'd like to say to fans watching, anything to take us out on before we go?
Oh, man. Like you said, support your indies. This is where the innovation is coming. I don't care if you pirate, as long as you play games and talk about them. This is where the conversation should be happening. So, I appreciate everybody who's keeping this industry alive and keeping it weird. That's what we need to keep doing.
All right. So with that, Cyrus, I will let you go. I know it's like probably around midnight where you are, so I'll let you get some sleep. But it has been a pleasure chatting with you. If you're free in the future, I would love to have you back on. And definitely would like to do a chat about kind of doing the voice acting side as well.
Absolutely.
All right. So, with that said, everyone, we're going to wrap things up for today's show. Again, do the YouTubing stuff, check out all the Discords, all my books, and be sure to look at Vampire Therapist. By the time this cast goes up, it should either be out or very close to being out. So be sure to give that a check. So, everyone, have a great rest of your night, and come back for daily discussions on game design here, and on game wisdom, where you some the art and science of games.